We're going to discuss, of course, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the Jordan Plain and the experiences that Lot and his family had. So besides having a need to have a clear understanding of what the Bible teaches doctrinally, I believe we also need to have a strong moral basis of understanding God's principles and what He sees as right and wrong, so that when we are challenged morally in whatever environment we find ourselves in college or in the world or anywhere at work, then if we have an understanding of God's principles of morality, then we'll know how to deal with those circumstances as they come up. The story of Lot and his family and the temptations they faced in living in the wicked city of Sodom, I think, can be helpful to us as we face our own moral challenges in life. So let's get into the story of Sodom and Lot and his family and see what we can learn from them. Of course, you've all learned the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're all familiar with it from Bible class and from our studies. It's found in Genesis, the 18th and 19th chapters. But the setting, of course, starts earlier, back in the 13th chapter. Remember that Lot was living with his uncle Abraham. And as Lot grew up, he had a family of his own, and he had herds of his own. And apparently the herdsmen of Lot were having a conflict with the herdsmen of Abraham. And so it was Abraham who suggested that maybe it would be better to part company. And this is what he said. He said to Lot, "If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left." And so by this text we see that Abraham gave Lot the first choice of where to live. And if you could place yourself in the middle portion of the land of Israel, you look over the land of where they were, and you're looking out over the Jordan Valley. In Genesis 13:3 it says, "Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly." So now, placing ourselves there and looking at the choice that Lot had, you would have to say from the natural eye, he chose wisely. Let's see. The Jordan Valley was a rich, beautiful valley, and the scripture describes it as being like the garden of the Lord. It's really saying that it was so lush, it was similar in a way to the paradise of the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve lived. And so after some harsh experiences that Lot had in Sodom, we're told that 3 angels of the Lord appeared to Abraham. And they came for 2 primary reasons. Of course, a really important one is that they came to announce the birth of Isaac. And they also came to tell Abraham what was going to happen to Sodom, that the Lord was going to destroy it. And in Genesis 18, we get an insight into how God viewed Abraham and how he respected Abraham. It says there, "And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." Now I think about that. The Lord is thinking, well, why should I hide this from Abraham? He felt that he owed Abraham an explanation regarding what he was going to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think about that and I wonder, well, the Lord knew that Abraham was going to be deeply affected by the destruction. And so I think he wanted Abraham to know not just what he was going to do, but he wanted Abraham to understand why he was going to do it. And I think about that in connection with our time that we live in at the end of the age. The reason that the Lord spoke to Abraham here and wanted to explain to him why he was doing it is very similar to why I believe he gives us the knowledge of the time of trouble. He's told us a lot about the time of trouble. He's told us a lot about what's going to happen in this time. And so my question is, why has the Lord revealed the time of trouble to you and me? Why do we know so much about what's impending for the world? Why has he detailed the destructive process that the world is going to experience and that eventually is going to culminate in the Battle of Armageddon? And I think we have a connection here between why he spoke to Abraham and why he's given us so much information. And I think it was because Abraham could be prepared for the destruction that was coming, and so that he could understand why the Lord was going to do it. Because Abraham was going to be affected by it, and so that he could, like I said, be prepared. And you know, brethren, I think it's the same reason he reveals the time of trouble for you and me, so that we could know what the Lord is doing, and so that we can prepare ourselves for it as well. Remember what Jesus said in John 15. He says, I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known unto you. So it's important that we understand these things, and more important, we understand why the destructive process is going on. Now in Genesis 18:21, there's an interesting verse. Here we have the angel of the Lord talking to Abraham. And he says, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me. And if not, I will know. In other words, the angel says, I'm going to go down to Sodom and see for myself if the evil is as wicked as I've heard. Now this is an angel of the Lord, remember. Why would an angel have to do that? He knew exactly the extent of evil in Sodom and Gomorrah. Why did he and other angels who were with him need to go and see for themselves? And I think, again, the whole scene was done for the benefit of the righteous, so that they could understand the justice of Sodom's destruction. You know, the sense of justice was very prevalent in Abraham. We see it immediately in his response. He says to the Lord, Lord, if there be 50 righteous people in Sodom, will you not destroy it for that 50's sake? And then at the end of verse 25, Abraham says, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And so you see right away in Abraham the sense of inner justice, and the Lord loved it. The Lord respected that. He wanted Abraham to understand that this was a just and right sentence, and that it was really being done for the good of the Sodomites. You know, when we look at the world today, when we look at the church systems of today, we know prophetically that there's going to be a destruction of the world order as we know it today. And we too, like Abraham, have to understand that the destructive work of the society we live in, as fearful as that might sound, is a just and necessary work. And that Armageddon, even though it's going to be a frightful time for a period, is really for the benefit of mankind. It's going to lead to the healing of all the nations of the earth. I think that is so important, to not dwell on the Armageddon aspect necessarily, but to look beyond it for the purpose of why God is sending the destruction. Only when we appreciate the justness of the time of trouble can we realize that we as Christians should not really be involved in the political and social reform of society. And it's not because we don't want it to be reformed. We certainly do. We see injustice all around us. But we can't be involved because we understand that the judgments of the Lord, what they are, and that they're true and honest and just. You know, Jesus used the example of an old wineskin. In the old days, they used to make a bottle for containing wine out of an animal skin. And he said, you can't take an old wineskin and put new wine into it, because an old wineskin is stretched out already, and when the new wine ferments, it'll expand and break the bottle. And he used that to describe what was going to happen at the first advent with the destruction of the Jewish system. And so in essence, he was saying, you can't fix the old one. You have to start with a new one. And that's what we're looking forward to, the start of a new government and a new system. You remember in the discussion between God and Abraham continued on after there weren't 50, and he said, Lord, if there's 45 who are righteous, and then they couldn't find 45, if there are 40 who are righteous, and then 30, and then 20, and finally it got down to 10, Lord, if there are only 10 righteous people in Sodom, would you not destroy the city? What a heart. What a wonderful spirit in Abraham. Here's what Brother Russell says about Abraham. He says, it is to his credit that he was unwilling to think of those people as badly as they deserved. Benevolent people generally are pretty sure to err in their judgment on the favorable side when they think of the weaknesses and villainies of their neighbors. Okay, now here's a little test for all of you who are online. If you were in Abraham's place, and you were told that this wicked city in the plain, these cities were going to be destroyed, would you throw up your arms and say, well, great, they're wicked, they deserve to be destroyed anyway? or would you have the tender heart of Abraham? Would you say, Lord, if there's just 10, would you say, knowing how wicked the city was? And so, how do we look at the wicked world around us? Do we look at it with the sense of, it's going to get just what it deserves? Or do we look at it with a sense of pain, that we know there's going to be suffering, and yet it's a just punishment that's coming? If Abraham were here, I think he would have looked at the world through very benevolent and kind eyes. Like Brother Russell said, there would be more of a willingness to err on the benevolent side. And I think that's the spirit the Lord is looking for in us. He would rather have us be grieved by the sins of others rather than just longing for their destruction. If there's any way it could be averted, we would love that. But for the good of all mankind, these things need to happen. And so I think it's very appropriate that Abraham, the father of faith, the receiver of the great promise, the great role model of faith, should have this benevolence as part of his character. Well, in Genesis 19, we finally see the angel coming to Sodom. And right away, he meets Lot, who was sitting at the gate. And we haven't gotten into the details of his interaction too much yet, but it's interesting that Lot is almost as gracious and generous as Abraham had been. It says that he bowed to them, and he implored them to come to his home, and then he prepared a great feast for them. That's exactly what Abraham had done. And so we see a benevolence in Lot that we saw in Abraham. And you think how reminiscent Lot is of Abraham. He's really a reflection of the character of Abraham. And maybe this attitude of hospitality comes from the simple lifestyle that they lived as shepherds. Most of us have never experienced a rugged life. But living in the rugged conditions of the mountains and the wilderness areas, I think both Abraham and Lot knew that there were inherent dangers in living in open country. And so when a stranger would come to their home, they would see that there was a real danger for these people. They were at a great disadvantage. And apparently these angels weren't carrying provisions and water and didn't have camels or anything. They were just walking. And so both Abraham and Lot saw that they needed to be gracious and help these angels, who they thought were ordinary men at the time. I grew up in a big city. I grew up in Chicago. And I think of how different things are in big cities than they might be in some rural communities. And I go downtown Chicago once in a while, and I notice that there's a coldness. There's a distance between people in large cities. If you ever take a walk in downtown Chicago, here's a picture of the Chicago River. You'll see that as people going by, there's very little eye contact. There's very little expressions on the people's faces. They're hurrying to their jobs or whatever they're doing. And I think, well, why is it like that? Why are people so cold as they interact with one another, or they don't interact with one another is the point. And I guess my answer to myself is, well, first of all, that happens because people just don't know each other as they're passing by, so it's almost a self-preservation mechanism. But brethren, someday it's not going to be like that. Someday people are going to walk down the streets of Chicago, and they're going to know everyone they meet. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity for mankind to feel a family bond with one another. And they're going to stop and talk to each other. There's going to be eye contact. There's going to be warm expressions of greetings. And so just imagine walking the streets of Chicago and New York and Paris and big places like that are just filled with people who are friends with one another and who trust one another and who care for the people who are walking by. There won't be that coldness or disconnection, that self-preservation mechanism that we have today. That's why man's governments have to go. One of the reasons, because they cannot create the type of society that we're talking about here. Because of the fall and because of sin and selfishness, there's a sterility to the world. There's a coldness to society that we live in. But that's going to be so different when the kingdom is established on the earth. In 2 Peter 2:7-8, the Apostle Paul is talking about Lot. And he calls him just and righteous. It says there, "And God delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among us in seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds." And when I read that, the question that comes to my mind is, if Lot was righteous and just, as the apostle says, and that the wickedness of Sodom vexed him so much. Why in the world did he live there? Why didn't he follow the example of his uncle Abraham and just simply stay away? Well, there had been a time earlier when he was still with Abraham that Abraham had gone to Egypt. And Brother Russell talks about that time and how that time in Egypt may have influenced Lot. And he says that seeing the worldliness of Egypt may have had a real effect on Lot. And then he asks, what was Lot's real failure? And he says, apparently it was his worldly mindedness, probably his desire to please his wife and daughters. He should have decided that their moral interests were far above all others and should have marked his course accordingly. And then Brother Russell draws a lesson for us. He says, what we do urge is that all the Lord's true people should seek first, primarily, the will of the Lord, his righteousness, his service, the things that would make for their peace and their everlasting blessing, rather than the things of time and sense and ease and worldly pleasure. Well, that's difficult to do, isn't it, brethren? To choose spiritual things, things that we cannot see, things that we cannot touch and hold and interact with, over temporal things that may please the natural senses. It's especially difficult to do if those around us are not doing it. When we associate with people who have different goals in life, and those goals are worldly, prosperity, jobs, wealth, whatever, how can we not be affected by that? Things rub off from those around us. How can we seek spirituality if we don't spend time with spiritual people? It's the whole principle of why the Lord wants us to meet together. And I think back on Lot, and I think, what a shame that he didn't have the strength of character to stay with Abraham in spite of what was happening with the herdsmen. I think they could have worked that out. But I think he wanted to break away. I think he wanted to be surrounded in a different atmosphere than the atmosphere that Abraham created. And so I see that probably Lot didn't really value the presence of Abraham enough. Because I think had he done so, his choice of where to live might have been very different. Well, as Lot entertained his guests, we see the citizens of Sodom showing some real wickedness in their hearts. And this is amazing to me. It says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people, from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do you to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. Now, of course, there's been some debate regarding what the men of the city actually wanted with the angels. Of course, they didn't know they were angels. They thought they were just new strangers in town. But I got to tell you, it seems very apparent by what they say and by the Lord's disgust with the perversity of the city that homosexuality was one of the abominations that these people had committed and that they wanted to commit with the angels here. In Jude verse 7, we read, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So going after strange flesh and wanting to know the men who were Lot's guests, I think all suggest they had homosexual desires towards them. This is, of course, one of the sins that was strictly forbidden in the Mosaic Law. In Leviticus 20, verse 13, it says, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. Of course, in addition to that, the Apostle Paul strongly condemns it in Romans 1:26 and 27. He says, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one towards another, men with men, working that which is unseemly and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meet. And so, in my mind, the scriptures are very clear that homosexuality is sinful. Let's talk about that question, Stephen. Why is it okay? Let me just get to that question in just a minute, because I do deal with that a little bit. Let's see. Now, of course, going back to these scriptures, we'll get back to Stephen's question in just a second. The argument might be made that the scriptures are the Christian standards and that they don't really apply to the world. But you know something? A sin is a sin, no matter who commits it. Look at the context in what Paul says in the very next verse. He says, "And as they did not choose to possess the knowledge of God, God delivered them over to a worthless mind to do improper things." Don't have a right to sin? And I would say no. No one has a right to sin. Adam and Eve did not have a right to sin. That's like asking if someone has a right to break the law. Do they have the freedom to sin? Oh, well, there's the difference. Yes. God gives them the freedom to sin. It comes with free moral agency, right? Adam had the freedom to disobey God. They practice sin to their own detriment, however. Paul's point is that by sinning, they are choosing not to make God a part of their lives. And so the question is, does that mean we campaign against this and other sins of the world around us? And again, the answer is simply that is not our job. The Christian today, I believe, is called to be sanctified, to be separated from the world, not to try and reform it. Someday, those reforms will come in the kingdom. But for us to be involved in the social issues around us would take us away from what I believe God would have us to do. And so Abraham, I think, is our pattern here, not Lot. Abraham avoided the sinful cities of the Jordan Plain and staying in the more isolated regions where he could tend his flock and raise his family and prosper spiritually. But you know what? Abraham still knew what a sin was. He still knew they were wrong and dangerous for any of the Lord to be involved in. You know, when Lot was standing by the door of his home trying to convince the men of Sodom to leave his guests alone, he makes a strange offer that Stephen asks about. In verse 8, he offers the two men his virgin daughters. And he says, "Do ye to them as is good in your eyes, only unto these men do nothing." Brethren, you know, when I read that, I have to tell you, that floored me. What father in his right mind would offer his two daughters to a mob of men like this? It's almost incomprehensible that a man like Lot would do that. And so in answer to your question, Stephen, he was absolutely wrong for doing that. Oh, he was right for wanting to defend the angels, but not this way, not by offering them his two daughters. And I think the point here is that Lot had unwittingly put himself and his family in a compromising situation by coming to Sodom in the first place. He knew what a wicked place it was. I doubt that he ever envisioned this specific scenario when he first decided to move there. But it happened because he had compromised the standards of keeping sanctified that his uncle Abraham lived by. And we see time and time again that the Lord was merciful in his experience. Let's see. Let me see if there's a question. Why is it okay? I don't know if that answers your question, Stephen, but I would say no, Lot was absolutely wrong for offering his daughters. Rachel Pedler, how do some religions rationalize the homosexual lifestyle? Well, I don't know. I've never really heard them harmonize it. I think there's a politically right thing to do, and today the politically right thing to do is to say everyone's okay, that this really isn't sinful. But that's why we need to have the Scripture standard of what righteousness is and not man's standard. You know, it's not that we hate people who are gay or homosexual, but we have to recognize the sin for what it is. With this, and there are even gay pastors, etc., out there. I can't comprehend how that situation can be tolerated, because as we read in the Scriptures, it's so clear that from God's standpoint it's sinful and should be not recognized and certainly not extolled as it is in our society today. Well, in this story here with Lot, he didn't realize who these men were who were visiting him until they did something miraculous. And it's similar to what Abraham experienced with these same angels. He didn't realize they were angels until they revealed it to him. Well, the way the angels revealed who they were was the situation with the mob outside. it was so simple. They go outside, they strike the mob with blindness, and the threat was over and done with. And then right after that, they ask about Lot's family members, and the angels then finally told Lot of God's intention to destroy Sodom. And then the next morning, they were to leave. Let's read this next passage of Scripture. It says, "And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto them, and they brought him forth, and set him without the city." Now, when we read that passage, did something jump out at you? Well, I'll tell you what caught my attention is the phrase, "while he lingered." Why would he linger, knowing that the city was going to be destroyed? And I try to imagine the situation there, and the way I picture it is that Lot kind of walked around the house and he thought, what should I take with me? I've only got till tomorrow to get ready. How am I going to pack everything? Maybe I'll have to go buy a cart and a horse where I can pack everything. And then as he's doing all this figuring in his mind, in his desire to take his possessions with him, the angel grabs him by the hand and he said, "Lot, there's no time. None of those things are important. Your life is at stake here. You have to leave everything and get out." And Lot believed the angel that Sodom was going to be destroyed, but he didn't have this sense of urgency to get away from it. It says he lingered. He hesitated. He thought about his possessions, and you know what? It could have cost him his life. And worse yet, it could have cost him his relationship with God. But again, we see the Lord's mercy, because the Lord saw deeply into Lot's heart. He saw that there was goodness there and conviction to righteousness. And so he dealt with Lot's hesitancy and his experience there. Well, the next scene shows that same type of hesitancy in Lot. In verse 17 and 18, it says, "It came to pass when they had brought them forth abroad, that he," that is the angel, "said, Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest thou be consumed. And Lot said unto him, O not so, my lord. Behold, now thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast showed unto me in saving my life. I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me, and I die. Behold, now this city is near to flee unto, and it is a little one. O let me escape thither. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live." Well, let me ask you again. Did something jump out at you when we read those verses? The angel says, escape for your life. Don't stay in the Jordan plain, but escape to the mountains. And Lot's reaction is, I can't go to the mountains lest some evil befall me and I die. Let me go to this small city over here. I'll be safe there. Well, the small city he's talking about is a little city by the name of Zoar. Zoar was one of the 5 cities on the Jordan plain. Now the angel had specifically said, don't stay on the plain. But again, we see Lot hesitating to leave everything behind. One aspect of the story that we always come to is what happened to Lot's wife. Remember that after Lot and his family arrived at Zoar, we're told in verse 24, Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And so apparently it wasn't just Lot who hesitated to leave everything behind. And maybe the Lord's specific punishment of Lot's wife showed that it was her influence that led Lot to hesitate in his decisions. We'll get back to this in a minute, but I just want to touch on some of the theories about the literal destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that exist. We have some very strong clues visible in the area even today. The scripture says that brimstone was used. Well, brimstone is actually sulfur, and sulfur is really found in abundance around the Dead Sea area where Sodom and Gomorrah are believed to have existed. Here, for example, is a picture of sulfur embedded in ash that's been found near the Dead Sea. So there's evidence that that's the right area. Another element found in the area that would make the destruction feasible is that bitumen is common in the area around the Dead Sea. In Genesis 14:10, we're told that the valley of Sodom, where the 5 cities were located, was full of slime pits. And the Hebrew word for slime means bitumen, or tar. And of course, as you know, tar and sulfur are very flammable materials. Now, a third element to me, which is the most fascinating, is in the area there's a major fault in the Earth's crust. Here's a world map showing the tectonic plates that make up the Earth's surface. You can't see them really. They're the dark lines there. We'll look at it a little more closely in a second. And of course, a key principle of plate tectonics is that the upper crust of the Earth actually floats on a fluid-like layer beneath it. And this layer beneath the crust is semi-molten, and so there's great heat associated with this molten rock. And of course, heated matter becomes more buoyant, and it rises, and as it cools, it sinks back down. So there's this cooling and heating effect causing currents in the fluid. And so the upper crust actually, which is floating on it, actually moves. The upper plates are moving on the Earth. And oftentimes these plates grind against one another. And where these plates meet are generally volcanic and earthquake areas. And mountains are sometimes produced by the movement and the upheaval of these tectonic plates. Well, the particular area that we're interested in is right here in the red circle, where the African plate, the one in orange, meets the Arabian plate, the one in yellow. Here's a closer look here. Notice the line where the plates meet. They go up through the Red Sea, they go up through the Gulf of Aqaba, through Israel, and then up into Syria and back down through Iran. This is the northern end of what is called the Great Rift Valley. The rift passes, let's see, I think there's another one here. The rift passes through the Jordan Valley, exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were supposed to have been. The Rift Valley, there's the line, there's the Rift Valley, there's the fault line where the 2 plates meet. It actually forms the Jordan Valley with mountains on either side of it. The Jordan River, where the red line is really, the Sea of Galilee up here, and the Dead Sea there, the big one, were all formed due to the depression caused between the 2 plates. Now these 2 plates are a little different than you would normally think. Rather than grinding against each other, these 2 plates are actually moving apart. And geologists describe it as kind of like a bar of taffy that's being pulled apart. If you do that, you'll see that where the taffy starts to come apart, the taffy gets really thin just before it breaks. And so where the Earth's crust gets thin, that part of the surface sinks downward. And that's exactly what's happening to the Earth's crust in the Rift Valley. Here's a view of the Sinai Peninsula from space. You can see the Rift Valley on the right there. The Rift Valley passes through the area exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were located. Now, here's an illustration of what's happening in the Jordan Valley. The African and the Arabian plates, as we've said, are moving away from each other, and the valley in between is sinking. Now, the Dead Sea is sinking even today, and scientists estimate that the Dead Sea lowers by as much as 13 inches per year. And of course, on a geologic timescale, that is incredibly fast. And because of the sinking action, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on the face of the Earth. As I said, the meeting of the 2 plates like this often causes earthquakes, and that's probably what happened in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, there doesn't seem to be significant volcanic activity in this area, so an earthquake is probably more likely as to what destroyed it. Now, with the abundance of sulfur and tar pits in the area, in an earthquake, pressure from beneath would have spewed molten rock and sulfur and tar up into the air and then rained down upon the city, appearing to have come from heaven. Now, just briefly, we'll talk about the exact location of the cities. Of course, there are a few prevalent theories. One theory that suggests that the cities are actually under the water of the southern tip of the Dead Sea, as shown here circled. Now, the southern end of the Dead Sea is interesting. It's partially separated, you see there, by a small peninsula. The deepest part of the northern section of the Dead Sea is over 1,000 feet deep. The southern end, however, is very shallow. It's only 10 to 15 feet deep. So So it's very likely that the southern end was later after the destruction of these cities. Now this has led some scholars to speculate that at one time the southern end was not covered with water, but was actually part of the Jordan Plain, and where the 5 cities mentioned in Genesis were located. Notice how the map shows them currently underwater. They've actually done diving expeditions there to see if they could find anything. I don't think they have. Another theory is that the cities were actually located on the east side of the Dead Sea, on the Jordanian side, on the plateau where 5 archaeological sites have actually been located. This is a satellite view, except for the stars and the numbers, but this is a satellite view showing where some archaeologists believe the 5 cities were located. Notice the northernmost city. It's a place called Bad el-Dra. Archaeologists have actually discovered a cemetery there where there are more than 20,000 tombs. And so some scholars believe that this is actually the site of Sodom. One more possibility. In 1989, a man by the name of Ron Wyatt was examining some formations along the western side of the Dead Sea. And he claims to have found these balls of sulfur surrounded by ash. In fact, that picture I showed you earlier was from his website. They were found at all 5 sites that he claims are the 5 cities and where they were located. And he located Sodom very near what is presently called Mount Sodom. And he believes that the 5 cities found on the eastern side of the Dead Sea were actually Moabite cities of a later time period. And so you can see that theories abound regarding the location exactly of the cities of the plain. But the fact that these cities were destroyed by God is evident because of the difficulty in finding them today. And maybe the uncertainty of their location simply suggests how complete the destruction of the Lord was. Now, even though there are natural reasons why this could have happened, it's great to have a natural explanation, but what makes this, of course, a miracle is the timing and the circumstances in which it happened. And of course, the lessons are powerful to people who want to be pleasing to the Lord, who want to avoid this kind of destruction, who want to be moral and pure in their lives. Notice from the scriptural account that there were more than 2 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. This is Deuteronomy, the 29th chapter. And here the Lord's warning Israel to obey the law and not to walk after the imaginations of their own heart. And then he says in verses 22 and 23, so that the generations to come of your children that shall rise up after you shall say when they see the plagues of that land and the sicknesses which the Lord hath laid upon it, and the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and burning, that it is not sown nor beareth, nor any grass groweth therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. Even all nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this land? And so this scripture tells us that there were actually 4 cities of the 5 that were destroyed on the Jordan Plain. The fifth city we mentioned, Zoar, probably would have been destroyed had not Lot gone there. Though the location of the 5 cities is disputed, when we look especially at the southern region of the Dead Sea, we have to wonder, my goodness, how could this area ever have been called the Garden of the Lord? How could this desolate area have once been lush, fertile, and wealthy? If you ever get a chance to go there, you'll see that the southern end of the Dead Sea is kind of a sickening place because of the level of salt and the destitute of it. In Ezekiel 16, we're told the real underlying reason for the sins of these 5 cities. It says, behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her, and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty, and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. There's more sins here than the immorality that we talked about. Pride is an awful sin. Fullness of bread, well, that's not so awful, but the abundance and the idleness that it caused in her led her to seek sinful things. And so there's a good lesson in there. It's a reminder to anyone who looks upon it of the importance that the Lord places on moral purity, on true, unadulterated worship. It's a test on us how we use our time. It's a test on us in how we use the fullness that we have in temporal things, that we not be idle, that we use our time and our talents in a way that would be pleasing to the Lord and not let the world infiltrate our lives. Jesus used Lot and Sodom as an example of what the conditions would be like when he would be revealed to the world. This is Luke 17:28-33. After comparing his second advent to the days of Noah, he says, "In like manner also as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed them all. Thus will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let not him who shall be on the roof and his furniture in the house descend to take it away. And in like manner, let not him who shall be in the field turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever may seek to save his life will lose it, and whosoever may lose it shall preserve it." Reprint 2857. Brother Russell says, "We may consider ourselves justified in considering Lot and his daughters who escaped to be illustrations whose antitypical lesson would apply in the present day. For as Abraham and his patient waiting represented the faithful, the overcomers, so Lot seems to represent the class in the end of the present age who do not walk sufficiently by faith and who seek not chiefly the kingdom and its righteousness, but who for the sake of earthly advantage are quite willing to risk their spiritual interests and the highest interests of their children by choosing fellowship with the world, by commingling to some extent with the world and the flesh and the devil. Such, the apostle tells us, shall be saved so as by fire. Such the Lord illustrates as coming out of great tribulation, washing their robes and making them white, and eventually obtaining the blessing, but not the chief one." And so the picture of Lot seems to be a very well-fitting picture of the great company's attitude, doesn't it? That looking back and seeing that his hesitancy to leave Sodom, the angel, remember, taking him by the hand and leading him out just before Sodom's destruction, I think pictures the dullness of the great company, that they're not perceptive enough to see what the Lord is really doing. And even when they do see it, they're reluctant to act upon it. Remember, even after leaving Sodom, he has this desire to go into Zoar. And I think it showed that he still had a connection with city dwelling, that somehow he felt more secure there. Remember, he said, "Lord, if I go to Zoar, I'll be safe. I won't be in danger like if I go to the mountains," where, as it turned out, the Lord was telling him to go. And of course, finally we see Lot's wife turning back to Sodom. Now, the way Jesus described her might suggest that it was maybe more just of a brief glance. He says that those in their house should not return. I'm saying that what Jesus said suggests that it was more than just a glance. He says those in the house should not return to take their possessions. And then immediately he says, remember Lot's wife. And so rather than just a quick glance backwards like we sometimes think to the burning city, I think she may have actually turned back and was intent on saving some of her possessions. But look at the price she paid. And I was thinking this a little bit more about this, that maybe it was more than her possessions. Remember one of the first things the angels asked? He asked about their family. And so I think that Lot and his wife may have had family who were still in Sodom. And there may have been a family connection. And I think maybe that's why the angels of the Lord gave them that night. Remember, they didn't leave until the next morning. They gave them the opportunity to talk to their family, to tell them what the Lord's judgment was and the destruction, and obviously they didn't listen. And so this may have been a much more complex testing of Lot and his wife than just their possessions. I think there was a family connection that they longed for as well. And so when we look at the overall experience and looking at they obviously valued their possessions as well. And a lesson for us, I think, is so important, that there is no worldly possession that we have that really is of any value. Lot's wife lost her life because she did value her possessions and maybe this family connection too. She wanted her things and she was willing to return to a burning city to get them. And I think for a moment, for myself, what would happen if I lost everything I owned? That I was just down to the clothes on my back. And I think, that would be hard. I've worked hard for the things I own. But I have to say, if I examine myself closely, and I say, you know what? If that would devastate me, in losing all my possessions, but still having the Lord, then I'd have to go back and remember the words of Jesus when he said, remember Lot's wife. Remember that the real treasure that we have is not the things that we possess. Those are nothing. Those go away. But it's in our relationship with the Lord, the spiritual life that we have. That is our real treasure in life. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. And I think God intended that she be a monument to poor choices. And so she stands as an example of people who chose the temporal over the spiritual. Her heart had a connection to the things she possessed. And even if there was a family connection, that was wrong as well, because he had the opportunity. And she should have been more obedient to the Lord. And Lot should have been a better husband and a better leader of the family. Lot's heart had a hesitance to let go of the things himself. It wasn't just his wife. But eventually he was able to see the Lord's grace and have his life saved. And so the lessons I think we should take from these examples are, don't judge success in life or happiness by any of the things that we possess. We have to understand, especially in the harvest of the age that we're in, that God's judgments are just and good, and that when we see them, we should cooperate with them, and we should never hesitate to do the Lord's will in our life. That his will is always the best and will lead to the richest blessings. And finally, the third lesson I'd like to draw is never to put ourselves or our families in a spiritually compromising position. And college is an environment that could be a spiritually compromising position, so I would just say be careful, know the Lord's standards, know the rights and wrongs, and don't put yourself in a position that could cause you spiritual harm. All of us, no matter where we're at, are surrounded by temptations every day, because those are the standards that the world uses to judge success. But you look back at the story and you ask, well, who was really successful here? Was it Lot or was it Abraham? Of course, the answer is easy. Abraham put the spiritual lessons far above anything temporal. Lot wasn't able to do that until forced to by the Lord. And so we hope the Lord helps each of you in your desire to serve him, to serve the truth, to serve righteousness, and to know the judgments of the Lord, and to persevere in our service to him.